today too. I'd like to thank Connie Casey, our communications director and food provider, and especially Cleopatra Hargett Lawton, our board member who suggested and initiated this presentation. The Carolina Nature Coalition is a community organization based here in New Bern, North Carolina, whose mission is to raise public awareness of environmental and environmental justice issues, and by engaging citizens in meaningful community action. Our view of the environment is expansive and includes not only the natural realm, but also the communities in which we live and the historic and cultural treasures that enrich our lives. And so I will now introduce our presenter. Laren Poole is a historic preservation specialist, wow, with the North Carolina State Historic Preservation Office. At the Eastern Branch in Greenville, she oversees the National Register and Survey programs for all of Eastern North Carolina. Originally from Chapel Hill, North Carolina, she joined the State Historic Preservation Office in January of 2023. And so I present Laren Poole.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me tonight. I really appreciate it. And I am going to be, my speaker is now muted, so if you need me, just wave at me if something's going wrong. As Mr. Schachter said, I am the National Register and Survey person for Eastern North Carolina. So I oversee those two programs for all 27 counties east of 95, including Craven County. And tonight I'm going to present to you about historic preservation, what historic preservation is, and some of the programs that we offer at the State Historic Preservation Office to preserve historic resources. So I'll go ahead and get my presentation on the screen for y'all. Hopefully, if not, I cannot hear if archaeological resources. And also applies to traditional cultural properties. And this is maybe a phrase you're not familiar with. This applies to resources where maybe properties where there aren't any standing structures to indicate the historic use or function of that property, but it has been in continuous use as part of a religious or cultural practice for a group of people. So for instance, maybe a religious site for a Native American tribe, a place where traditional plants and ceremonies are held, or plants are gathered and ceremonies are held, or something like a Baptist tent revival site. You might not know that there's ever been a tent revival there. It might just be an empty lot, or look like an empty lot. But when the tent revival happens, all the tents come, they build some temporary structures, and as soon as the revival is over, it all disappears. That still is a place that we want to preserve, because even though there aren't standing structures, it's an important place for someone's cultural or religious practice. It's been in continuous use throughout its history, and it is part of an identity of a very particular group. So there's a lot of different resources that we look to preserve when we're looking at historic preservation. It's not just buildings and structures. But preservation, some of the main goals of preservation is to recognize the importance and value of historic and cultural resources, and to encourage their continued use and reuse over time. Because the best thing for a historic building, the best thing for a site like a cemetery, for instance, is that they are maintained, that they are taken care of, that they are in use. The longer they sit empty and vacant, the more likely they are to fall into decay or deterioration, and eventually maybe even disappear from the landscape. So we always want to encourage the reuse of these buildings. They're not just supposed to be static structures that are frozen in time, which you will see as we kind of move through the presentation. But why do we preserve historic resources? There's a couple different reasons. Obviously, all of us history buffs and architecture nerds out there are really excited about preserving the buildings themselves and preserving the aesthetic character of our communities, of these individual buildings. But it also preserves our heritage and our history. These spaces are tangible connections to the past. They allow us to interact with the past on a daily basis. It's not just something that you have to go to a museum to experience. You can walk down Main Street and you can feel the connection to all of the people that built this place, that built this community, and that helped contribute to where it is today. So it really is that tangible connection, that physical connection between past and present, and it provides great opportunities for education. Also, it's beautiful to look at, and it helps to preserve a sense of community identity and a sense of place. And by sense of place, I mean what makes a place distinctive. How do you know that you're in New Bern versus you're in Beaufort or Swansboro? How do you know when you walk into that town that you are where you're supposed to be? And it's those characteristics and those qualities that are very individualized, that are very distinctive to a certain area. And those can be its architecture, it could be its landscape features. All of those contribute to that sense of place. So it's not just about history, but it's also about community, and it's about connection to community. But it's not just about history. There's a very strong environmental factor when it comes to preservation. A term that you may have heard or may not, it's certainly something that I heard a lot as I was getting into preservation, was that the greenest building is the one that's already built. And this is a very common phrase. And basically it means that these buildings have a lot of captured carbon footprints. Essentially, they have a lot of embodied energy from their construction and the mining of the original materials, whether it was lumber or clay or stone, to create these buildings, the finishing of those products into the final materials, the transportation of those materials, and then the construction itself all has captured energy within that building. And when we rehabbing these buildings, reusing these buildings is really an environmentally friendly way for us to develop our communities. Historic buildings are often dismissed. I know you've probably heard that, historic buildings are not energy efficient. It's something we hear quite often, especially when we're talking about windows. People always want to replace windows. It's a very common thing. But actually, historic buildings are incredibly energy efficient just in and of themselves. Many of them were constructed during a time period where there wasn't electricity or there wasn't air conditioning. They were built to take advantage of natural light and ventilation, and through these big windows. You might see big windows on a house, big porches along the exterior of a house. The windows are designed and situated on the building to catch that cross breeze and provide cross ventilation, kind of ye olde air conditioning. You might see transom windows as well that can be opened and closed to allow heat to escape the building. All of these are those design features that make this building more sustainable and can actually reduce your energy usage and energy costs overall. And also things that people are putting into sustainable buildings that are being built today. A lot of the conversations we're having around sustainable buildings revolve around how do we take advantage of natural lighting, how do we make these buildings less difficult to heat and cool? How do we reduce our dependency on air conditioning, which can be very costly in terms of energy? And so these are things that are conversations that we're having around modern buildings that are already existing within historic buildings as well. And historic buildings can also be retrofitted. So part of the rehabilitation process is to retrofit these buildings with updated systems. So maybe they have electricity that was added to the building or an existing climate control system, but they're not efficient. They're not working at their best. They can be retrofitted. They can be installed into these buildings in a way that maintains their character, but also allows them to be even more energy efficient. We can put storm windows on the exterior of historic windows. If they are maybe a little bit drafty, we can rehab those windows to make them more airtight and prevent heat and cooling loss as well. And we have plenty of buildings that after the rehab process is completed that have been LEED certified. So it is possible to take a historic building, which in my opinion is already very green and very sustainable, and make it even more environmentally friendly, even more energy efficient. These buildings are also often located within walkable neighborhoods and urban areas, which reduces our dependency on automobile travel, reduces carbon emissions. It also takes advantage of existing infrastructure, so you don't need to use additional resources to build new roads and sewer systems and utilities. And that is all, again, feeding back into that smaller carbon footprint associated with historic buildings. They're also built of higher quality materials. The wood that you're going to find in a historic house is going to be much more durable and much stronger, have a stronger tensile strength than any of the wood that you're going to find in a modern constructed house. They are going to stand the test of time, especially if they're properly maintained, and they're not going to fail as quickly as some of the more modern materials that we use, those composite materials, those synthetic materials that we use, that once they fail, and they need to be replaced entirely. Whereas historic materials like wood and brick and stone and steel can be repaired again and again and again, and can even get them replaced without having not going to biodegrade. It's not biodegradable. Even if it does, if a window has rotted or it can't be, it is still going to be biodegradable material. So, truly, and to rehab a historic history of the area, for the history of our communities, the history of that building, but it's also a good investment environmentally. Final point I want to look at, of course, there are many reasons why I could talk all night about it, but the final one is community revitalization. And this is something that is very near and dear to our heart at the Historic Preservation Office. We work with individuals within communities, we work with local governments, we work with small businesses quite frequently, and we see the impact of historic preservation on our small towns, especially here in the East, that may not necessarily get the traffic that some of the bigger towns do. And preservation really is an important tool for community revitalization. It takes these buildings that are vacant and maybe underutilized and puts them back on the tax roll. It creates opportunities for new jobs. It also generates new tax revenue. It creates rental income and business revenue as well. So it takes these spaces that maybe are sitting vacant, that are maybe underutilized. They're not, the whole building isn't being used. Maybe it's just the first floor because the upper floors of that commercial building that used to be a residence or office spaces have been closed off. And it puts them back into service in a way that is truly functional and that fully utilizes that space. It also creates density, especially when we're talking about urban areas or even just a small town. I know not properties are located urban areas or even smaller urban areas, but in these downtown areas of land, to have a smaller section of great for the environment in one respect, but it also means that, again, people are able to walk to the bar, access even just downtown services, like going to, and it's much more accessible. It draws people to town areas. I know a lot of movement out to the suburbs and out into suburban areas. And getting people back into the downtowns is really key to revitalizing our small towns and our communities. And research has really shown that older buildings produce higher paying jobs, which is great because of the specialization of the craftspeople that work on historic buildings. It's higher paying jobs than new construction. And the money also tends to stay in the local economy rather than going to larger developers who might use outside suppliers for their materials. Typically with preservation, you're looking at local contractors, local craftspeople, and possibly even local sources for materials as well. So all of that feeds back into the local economy. It also creates opportunities for cultural and heritage tourism, which is a new source of revenue for a lot of our small towns as well. Obviously, we have a lot of heritage tourism and a lot of just tourism in general here in the East with the coastline. but sometimes our smaller towns, especially those that are maybe out in rural areas, will get bypassed on the way to the beach. And we really want to create places where people are interested in coming to spend some time, spend their money, and also just appreciate what these small towns have to offer. They have beautiful architecture, they have wonderful people, and with the right level of investment, you can really get people to come into these areas. Heritage tourism, heritage tourists are not interested in seeing they're not interested in seeing your strip malls. They want to see unique, distinctive places with the historic character and the cultural connection, the connection to tradition, the connection to the history of the place. And they are more likely to spend more money than your average tourist. They typically spend, in North Carolina, there was a study done in 2005 by the Arts Council, and it was found that they spend over $100 per person per day, which is about a third more than the national average at $70 per day. So there is like a financial component to it. You're drawing people in. You're not only just getting people into your downtowns and into your businesses and into your restaurants and your bars and your shops, but you're also getting them to spend their money because they care about these places. They're drawn to these places and they want to see them thriving and they want to spend their money here. So it creates all kinds of different opportunities. There's all kinds of different reasons to preserve historic buildings. I always like to say that not everyone loves history, but everyone loves money. So even if I can't hook someone on the historic component and appreciating the heritage and the history that these buildings embody, usually you can get them with the economic motivator as well, or the money component. So, but now that we've talked a little bit about why we preserve, let's talk a little bit about what the State Historic Preservation offers to preserve historic resources and how we preserve historic resources in North Carolina. And I'm mostly going to focus on the architectural survey and the National Register side of things because those are my specialties. But I do also want to give you an overview of some of the other services that we provide and give you the contact information for some of our other staff members who you might be interested in talking to. First, I'm going to talk about architectural survey. One of the functions of the State Historic Preservation Office is to serve as a repository for information about historic resources across North Carolina. So to this end, we maintain survey files on historic resources in our archives in Raleigh, as well as in our archives in the Western Office in Asheville. So every single historic resource that our office is aware of that has been surveyed, that is listed in the National Register of Historic Places, has a file in our archives in Raleigh. And if you are interested in some information about your property, if you own a historic property, you can reach out to our office and see if we have a file on your property, and that contains all the information, all the documentation that we have about that historic resource. So that is open to the public and available to the public, and we're happy to share them with everyone. We also maintain an online GIS portal called HPO Web, and that's what you're seeing here on the screen. This is actually HPO Web, a screenshot of HPO Web for New Bern, and it shows all of the historic resources that we have surveyed that are listed in the National Register, everything, all across the state. But here you can see that the blue properties are our National Register properties. Green properties are added to the state study list, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit. We have purple properties represented here, which are our local historic districts and local landmarks. And then the orange pins that you see here as well are representative of survey properties. So maybe they aren't eligible for listing in the National Register. Maybe they just haven't. No one's done the research to see if they could be eligible for listing in the National Register. But we do, if it has an orange pin, then we do have a survey file on it. And so even if your house is not listed in the National Register, we still have information on it, most likely. And part of how we get all of this information is through conducting countywide surveys. So our office regularly conducts countywide surveys, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's either one of our staff members. Yes.
If you're not sharing your PowerPoint.
Am I not? No. It told me I was. Now we're seeing it.
Yes, very good.
All right. The struggles with Zoom. All right. So now we're seeing HPO Web. Correct. Good. Okay. So this is HBO Web. You can see all these resources. Blue resources are National Register, purple are local, green are our study list, and orange is survey property. So now you can actually see. And I still have an echo if you want to mute me. Okay. One of the ways that we get this information is through our countywide surveys, and we conduct countywide surveys on a regular basis. These are done either by one of our staff members or by a private consultant that is hired either by our office or by another interested party, say a local government, and they go out and survey all the resources particularly looking for resources that we haven't previously surveyed, but also updating records for properties that maybe were surveyed in the 70s or 80s. And so we want some updated information about them. And they go out, they talk to people, they document these resources, they take photographs, and all of that information goes into our archives in Raleigh and is then represented here on HPO Web. Right now, we recently finished a survey in Edgecombe County. We recently finished one in Clay County. I know there's one ongoing in Rocky Mount, and also there's one that's, I believe, going to start in Wilson very soon. And then there's two more happening out west in Montgomery County, and then another county that I can't remember off the top of my head, but we have them happening all the time. So if you see a person who's going, knocking on doors, talking to people, taking pictures of houses, it's probably an architectural survey person. And if you are aware of any resources that you would like to be documented, you are welcome to speak to those surveyors and let them know and point them in the right direction, because you guys are the people who know your communities best. You know what resources are important to you. And we do really rely on the public and our local partners to point us in the direction of historic resources that we might not otherwise know about. And that brings me to my next point, is that we also conduct regular site visits to document individual properties. So for instance, if you have a property that you think we should know about, you can call our office, contact our office, and we can go and do a site visit, document the property, and create a survey file, and also create a record here on HPO Web. So we really rely, like I said, on the public to guide us to those historic resources and help us record the history, because again, you know your history best, you know those important resources best, and we could even potentially work with you to get them listed in the National Register, which I'm about to talk about now. So if y'all are not familiar, the National Register of Historic Places was established in 1966 by the National Historic Preservation Act. It is the official list of districts, sites, buildings, structures, and objects significant in American history and culture, architecture, engineering, and archaeology. So basically is a list of properties that we feel, that the federal government at the very least are important to our history. They're important for their architecture. They're important for their association with a specific person, or they're important for their archaeology. The National Register is an honorary designation and that recognizes the history and importance of a property, but it does not place any obligation on a private property owner using private funds to maintain or alter their property. Just because it's listed in the National Register doesn't mean that it's open to the public. It doesn't mean that you can't make changes or modifications to the property. It doesn't mean you can't sell it. And it also means that it doesn't mean that you can't demolish a property. I like to this, that you can list it one day and demolish it the next if you want to. The federal government and the state has no say in what you do with your property. There are a few instances where there might be regulation have to do when there's federal funding or federal oversight involved. Say it's house or something like that, and that would come under our office for review. It's to apply for a grant, so a nonprofit or a local that has some sort of restrictions regarding National Register properties or Secretary of the Interior standards, that might place And I'm going to talk more about tax credits a little bit later, but it is one of you can apply for the Rehabilitation Tax Credit Program, which that program allows property owners to recoup a portion of the money that they invest in tax credit. So it's a great program, and I'm going to go into a little more detail at the end of that, but just know that that's one of the benefits of being listed in the National Register. Also, National Register designation does not necessarily prevent a property a federal project is involved. So for instance, if a road project is coming through, for instance, or a house is in the path of that new roadway project, there's federal oversight involved. They're required to take into account historic resources and impacts on those historic resources during the planning and execution. Require them not to tear down the house. It doesn't require a specific outcome, but at least involves historic properties in that conversation as we're looking like a road project, maybe a new transmission line is going through. They're getting money from the federal government in the form of grants or something like that. We may be involved in that process as well. And at least we have an opportunity comment on it. And generally, federal agencies do try to avoid impacting historic resources where they can. And even if a resource is going to be adversely impacted by a project, there's usually some sort of mitigation to kind of offset the loss of the historic value of that property. So sometimes that's funding an architectural survey, and sometimes it's doing interpretive signage, but there's usually some benefit to the historic preservation process if a historic resource does have to be impacted. So those are just some of the things that you might need to consider if your property is listed in the National Register. But how do you get your property listed in the National Register? Generally, when we're looking at National Register properties and evaluating, we're looking for two things. We're looking for significance, which is what makes that property important, what makes it special and eligible for listing in the National Register, which is the degree to which it retains who had a major impact on our world at a local, state, or national level. These are just two examples. One is in Halifax. The William R. Davie House in Halifax is associated with an early pioneer in North Carolina. And also the Golden Asrow and Ruth Holly Frink's house in Edenton, which was listed fairly recently, is associated with a local civil rights leader. So it's associated with a specific person. Buildings and be listed for their architecture or engineering. And this is probably the one that people understand the most as well, that you look at a house. So an example here is the Cupola House in Edenton, but we also see bridges listed under Criterion C quite often for their engineering. And usually it's because that building or structure represents a particular type or a method of construction or a particular architectural style, or is associated with a particular craftsperson or architect. So that's Criterion C. And the last one is Criterion D, and that's for information potential. And this mostly applies to archaeological sites, and it's more about what kind of information could be derived from that site if there were archaeological investigations done on that property. So we don't deal with that too much on our side of things. That's usually left to the Office of State Archaeology, but it is one area of significance for historic properties. The other thing we're looking at is integrity. And like I said, that's the degree to which a property retains its historic appearance, features, materials, its setting, all of those things that help that property to convey its significance and help us to understand its history and its importance. So there are 7 aspects of integrity. You can read about them here on the screen. I'm not going to go into too much detail about it. But basically, a property doesn't have to be absolutely pristine. We don't expect people to live in house museums. We don't expect that a house has never been changed over time, but the building or the structure or the site needs to retain sufficient integrity to be able to communicate its history, to tell its story, and to represent that particular time period that it's kind of embodying. So the 7 aspects of integrity are location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association. Feeling and association are a little bit more abstract, but basically it plays into a property's ability to communicate that significance. How does it tell us that it's important? Is it that it represents a particular time period when an event happened or when a very important person lived there? Does it represent that particular style that's associated with a particular time period, et cetera, et cetera. So those are the two things that we look at when we're looking at National Register properties and what we use to evaluate properties for listing in the National Register. I'm going to quickly run through the National Register process just in case you're curious if anyone is anxious to get your property listed on the National Register. It is a two-step process in North Carolina. The first step is to get added to the state study list, and the study list is sort of like a state register. You might have heard of other states that have a state register. We don't have a state register here in North Carolina, but this sort of functions in a similar way. Basically, the study list is a list of properties that our office feels is either eligible for listing in the National Register or at the very least deserving of additional study to determine if they could be eligible for listing in the National Register. Applications are typically submitted by a property owner or an interested party, and it's a relatively simple application. It just gives us enough information to be able to assess the property as well as some photographs. And once a property is added to the state study list, the preparation of you can proceed with a National Register nomination with reasonable assurance that it will be listed in the National Register. And this whole process is to make sure that you don't go through that journey of writing a National Register nomination, submitting it to the Park Service, only to find out that it wasn't eligible to begin with. So it allows us to vet properties that might be nominated for the National Register. So once it's on the study list, you can proceed with a National Register nomination. National Register nominations are research-based documents that are prepared to state and federal standards. They are often prepared by National Register consultants, and these are private contractors that basically write National Register nominations for a living. So there is a financial component to it, but we also have people every year who decide they want to undertake this kind of project on their own and do the research and write the nomination themselves. And we are happy to guide them through that process and provide them with any resources they need. And usually from start to finish, usually from study listing all the way to actually getting it listed in the National Register, the process takes about a year. It just depends on the resource, but about a year is pretty consistent. But National Register and survey are great ways to recognize the history and the importance of a property. But when it comes to actually physically preserving historic resources, is really the territory of our Restoration Services branch. Our Restoration Services branch is able to provide technical advice to property owners who are interested in restoring, maintaining, or rehabilitating historic properties. They conduct site visits. They are happy to speak with you on the phone. If you just have questions about owning a historic building, they're often labors of love and they do require maintenance. And there's more significant problems, but our Restoration Services branch members are very knowledgeable and have a lot of experience in the field and can really come up with creative solutions, or can at least provide you with maybe some names of contractors. We won't tell you who to hire, but we do maintain a list of contractors and craftspeople who work here in the East as well. So if you're looking for someone to rehab your, maybe they're suffering from some condition issues, our Restoration Services members can help you with that. They also consult with property owners and communities about disaster preparedness and recovery. I know that in New Bern, I believe it was after Florence, they were boots on the ground pretty soon after the floodwaters receded and talking to property owners about how to dry out their houses, how to replace materials, what needs to be replaced, what could be dried out and restored, and also providing advice about how to retrofit historic houses so that they can weather these storms better. Flooding and hurricane winds are always going to be an issue here in the East, and I know our Restoration Services members are incredibly knowledgeable and have a lot of experience, and this is something that we're dealing with right now in the western part of the state because of Hurricane Helene. Our Restoration Services members are very busy out there working with property owners to help them to recover from that storm. So they are a great resource. And I'm going to talk a little bit about disaster preparedness and historic resilience in a little bit, but I wanted to mention that here as well. The other big thing that our Restoration Services members do is they administer the Rehabilitation Tax Credit Program. This is a great program. It has done billions of dollars worth of tax credits projects since the program began. And it really helps to encourage property owners to reinvest in their historic properties. It provides that incentive, that economic incentive to reuse and restore historic buildings. First of all, a property, in order to take advantage of the tax credits, needs to be either listed in the National Register individually or be a contributing resource to a National Register listed historic district. And basically, a contributing resource, it's something that you can find within the National Register nomination. You'll see a property will have either a letter like C or NC next to its name, or it might have the words contributing or non-contributing. And if you have questions about whether or not your historic building is eligible for the tax credit program or is a contributing building to a historic district, please feel free to reach out to our office and we will do that legwork for you and let you know whether or not it is eligible for the tax credit program. And contributing buildings, just FYI, they're buildings that date to the period of significance for a historic district, meaning the period of time in which a historic district gained its historic significance. So it might be a date span like 1890 to 1940, for instance, and the building that you're dealing with, if it's contributing, will be built during that time span and also retains good integrity. So it has those physical characteristics that communicate its association with the surrounding district. So again, if you have questions about that, if you own a historic building and you're wondering whether or not you could qualify for the tax credit program, please feel free to reach out to us and we are happy to help you with that. I'm not the tax credit person. I'm going to give you the contact information for our restoration services members here in the East in just a moment, but I am going to give you a brief overview of this, and all of this information is available on our website as well if you are interested in more information. But in terms of tax credits, there are two types. There's an income producing and a non-income producing tax credit. The non-income producing applies to residential owner-occupied properties, meaning that it is your primary residence. Maybe it's a secondary residence like a vacation home or a family home that you use as kind of a home place, but a owner-occupied residential property. And there is a 15% state tax credit that applies for those kinds of properties. But if it's an income producing property, for instance, you derive some form of income, maybe it's a rental property, an Airbnb, maybe it's a business, something along those lines. So you derive any form of income from it, you could qualify for the income producing tax credit, which is a 20% federal credit and a 15% state credit. And that comes off of your taxes at the end of the year that you pay in April every year. It comes off of your income taxes. And obviously that is, it depends on whether or not you qualify for the tax credits and also whether or not you can use all the credits. I will let our restoration services members speak to that. But it is a really wonderful program. And there is also a 5% bonus for our tier 1 and tier 2 counties. And that's a designation from the Department of Commerce in terms of economic development. And most of our counties here in Eastern North Carolina are tier 1 and tier 2 counties. So if you do have a commercial property, you do have an income producing property, you could receive upwards of a 40% tax credit for qualifying properties. So it's a really great program. We've seen a lot of work done with the tax credit program, whether it's individual property owners rehabbing their houses like this one that you see here on the screen in Beaufort, or whether it's a big property. So mill properties are very popular. Things like Rocky Mount Mills, for instance, was a tax credit project. There have been numerous tax credit projects in New Bern as well, all across the state, but not just in big towns. It's also in our small towns as well. We see a lot of tax credits in small towns, and they can be very helpful in that community revitalization that I was talking about earlier. The one caveat, and again, I kind of alluded to this earlier, that I will say is that these projects have to adhere to the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation. And that is a set of standards that aims to preserve the historic character of a building while allowing for necessary upgrades and modifications. So they're quite a flexible set of standards, and so they're not restrictive. They don't prevent you from doing everything that you might want to do, but it does aim to preserve those historic features as well as primary spaces. So if you want to be knocking out walls and replacing your historic windows with vinyl, that might not work for a tax credit project. But if you own a historic property, it's listed in the National Register or it's in a National Register district, and you're planning on doing renovations or repair work, maybe you've been looking to put on a new roof or redo the HVAC system, redo the electrical, maybe your windows need some work, it is always worthwhile to contact our office, speak to a restoration services member, and see if your work could qualify for a tax credit project, because every little bit helps. Historic properties are a labor of love in many cases. They are wonderful properties, and I think they are incredibly valuable, but I also know that they are an investment and they are a continuing investment. So every little bit helps, and the tax credit project may be a way for you to get a little bit of that money back in the form of a tax credit. So in the East, we have 2 restoration specialists who oversee the tax credit program and also can help you if you do have questions about restoring or rehabbing historic properties. Reed Thomas is the restoration specialist for most of the northern half of our eastern region, so Dare, Currituck, Camden, Pasquotank, Perquimans counties, etc. And then we also have a new restoration specialist whose name is Chris Stone. He just started with us recently, and he is covering the kind of southern half of our region here. So Nash, Edgecombe, Wilson, Pitt, Beaufort, Washington, etc. So if you have properties in those areas, if you're interested in tax credits for a property here in the East, please feel free to reach out to them, and they are happy to work with you. They are really great and very knowledgeable. So we're very, very proud of our restoration services branch here, and they get a lot of calls. They are quite busy. So which we're always happy. We're always happy when we're busy. And we're also always happy to do a site visit, by the way. We love getting out of the office and going to look at historic buildings and talking with people and learning more about them. So that's a fun part of the job. So never feel like you're bothering us or you're taking up too much of our time. And so in addition to National Register survey and our restoration services branch, we also work with local governments. So we have a local government coordinator. Her name is Christy Brantley, and she works with our local governments with their local preservation commissions. Local governments. I'm sorry. I have an echo again. Local governments, state enabling legislation, have the power to create local historic preservation commissions, and they then have the power to recommend the designation of local districts and landmarks. Some of you might be familiar with this. If you live in New Bern, there are local historic districts, and there are also local landmarks. So once these districts and landmarks are created through it's a special zoning ordinance that is passed by the local municipality. The commission then has the power to regulate changes to historic resources within that jurisdiction. And this means that they get to regulate alterations to existing buildings, as well as the building of new buildings, and even sometimes demolitions. Not every commission regulates demolitions, but most do regulate demolitions. They don't necessarily prevent demolitions, but they can basically pause a demolition for up to a year. And all of this is to help to preserve the historic character and the important, very special characteristics that make that area, that neighborhood, that downtown district, attractive to people, that make it unique and that make it distinctive, and really maintain that sense of place and a community identity. So this is where preservation really gets its teeth, is at the local level. When it comes to National Register, as I said earlier, there's no restrictions on a property owner unless they opt into one of those optional programs. This is where preservation gets its teeth, where you really have regulations and control over alterations to historic buildings. And it may, this process, again, people have to go to the commission, apply for changes to your house. You may have had to do this before. You go before the commission, you apply for a change to your house, and you receive, hopefully, a certificate of appropriateness that certifies that you can go forward with the work, and also certifies that the work that you're doing is appropriate for that building, appropriate for the character of that surrounding district, and is not going to be disruptive to the historic character of that district or of that local landmark. I also want to note that local landmarks, they're held to a slightly higher level of scrutiny. These typically apply to individual properties, and these are properties that are of special and extra importance to a community. So they are held to a slightly higher standard, but those properties, then a property owner who owns a local landmark can apply for a 50% property tax deferral, which is a very wonderful bonus. So if you own a locally landmarked property, That is certainly one of the benefits of being a local landmark. Yes, you're underneath the regulation of the commission, but you do get that lovely 50% property tax deferral. I know that there are several developers as well who do big projects that go for local landmark designation to make it even more attractive for them in terms of the finances and the numbers. So it's also a great incentive for just preservation in general. But that is something that you can apply for if you own a locally landmark property. But that does not apply to properties in a local historic district. It's only those extra special properties that have been locally designated as individual properties. If you are ever interested in what regulations are being used to govern these local historic districts, then you can check out the design guidelines for your particular historic district. These are adopted by the commission and are then used to evaluate proposed changes to local landmarks and to historic districts. So those are the regulations that they are using, and they're often based on the historic and architectural characteristics of a particular district. So usually they are there to preserve that character, prevent inappropriate changes, and make sure that any new buildings that are constructed in that local historic district do not disrupt the character of that local historic district. We also have a program through the National Park Service called the Certified Local Governments Program, and this allows local governments to go through a series of steps to apply to become a certified local government, and it gives them access to a couple of different things. The first is that it allows them to review National Register nominations within their jurisdiction. So if a property is listed within the New Bern local historic district, they are allowed to review it and provide comments to our office. They are also given access to our federal pass-through grants, and these are provided through the Historic Preservation Fund from the federal government to our office, and a portion of that money goes into what we call our federal pass-through grants, or our CLG grants. And this is money that the CLGs can apply for that can be used to fund National Register nominations, surveys. It can be used to fund brick and mortar improvements as well. If there's a particular project, or workshops. We've had plenty of workshops, window repair workshops, cemetery maintenance workshops that we've hosted, that have been hosted using CLG funding. It's a really great opportunity. There aren't that many grants out there, unfortunately, for local governments to apply for preservation. And so this is a great opportunity for those local governments, for those local commissions to engage in preservation and receive funding for that. So that's local preservation. If you are interested, if you maybe would like to start a local commission in your town, maybe your town doesn't have a local commission, or if you're interested in or you have any questions about local government or CLGs, I encourage you to reach out to Christy Brantley. Her contact information is on the screen. She is our CLG and local government coordinator. And she can answer any questions you have about local governments, local historic districts, etc. If you live in New Bern as well, as I said, there is a local commission in New Bern, and I encourage you to reach out to them as well if you have questions about being in a local historic district or receiving local landmark status in New Bern. They are great resources, and we work with them regularly. The last thing I want to talk about before I wrap up tonight is a recent project that it's currently ongoing with the UNC School of Government. We have worked with their NC Impact initiative, as well as the North Carolina State University Coastal Dynamics Design Lab, the North Carolina State University College of Design, to create a historic resiliency project. And this project was funded by the Emergency Supplemental Historic Preservation Fund, which is a fund that was created that provided money to those states impacted by Hurricane Florence and Michael, as well as Typhoon Yutu. So in addition to providing funding for recovery efforts, they also provided funding for various preservation projects. And so this is one of the projects that we completed. It's currently ongoing with the UNC School of Government. And basically the Historic Resilience Project examines the impacts of hurricanes, floods, and other natural disasters on our historic resources in North Carolina. This is actually a map from one of the publications that they produced as part of this project. And it shows all the historic resources that are located in basically hot zones or areas that are affected by natural disasters. So flooding, for instance, at-risk properties in those flood zones. And there are lots of great, really great maps and things like that in that publication to look at if you're interested. And those are available online, and I'll tell you a little bit more about them in a second. But in addition to just providing this information and doing an analysis to look at what resources are at risk and how natural disasters like floods, hurricanes, tornadoes, fires impact historic resources, they also sought to equip local communities and property owners with the necessary tools to preserve and protect historic resources. So it's not just about, examining it, it's also giving practical solutions. How do we retrofit buildings? How do we protect buildings in the future in the face of climate change? So that's kind of the focus of this project. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the publications that came out of this as well. As I said, these are available online for free as PDFs. They're on the Historic Resilience Project website. And they are wonderful publications. I actually have the hard copies next to me here, and they have a lot of pictures and diagrams and charts and maps that are so helpful in understanding how historic resources are impacted by natural disasters. The first publication is the Historic Preservation Primer, and that is aimed at all audiences. It's not just for local governments or for certified local commissions. It basically aims to provide an introduction to historic resilience and provide contextual information about the impacts of natural disasters and weather events on our resources, as well as an overview of state and federal hazard mitigation resources, so things that you can access pre and post storm or event, and also detailed examples of appropriate resilience adaptations for historic properties. So something we've been encountering the last few years as climate change has started to give us more and more hurricanes, worse hurricanes, more natural disasters overall. Is looking at flooding, particularly in the east, and elevating properties has been a big issue. How do we elevate historic properties, raise them off the ground, raise them out of the flood zone, but also retain their historic character and their historic appearance? Because when you take a historic building that was pretty low to the ground and you suddenly put it on 6-foot stilts, it really changes the appearance of that. It really changes the appearance of a historic district, and let alone that individual property, but a historic district as well. So how do we balance maintaining these historic properties, retaining their historic character, but also making sure that they're not going to be taken out by the next hurricane, the next flood? How do we make sure that when that flood occurs, that these buildings are protected and are able to weather those storms better? So that is the goal of this project, and you get an overview of that in the Historic Resilience Primer. So if you are an individual property owner and you're interested in this, you're interested in learning more about climate change and how it affects our historic resources and potentially some opportunities to improve or adapt historic buildings to weather those storms better, I highly recommend taking a look at the Historic Resilience Primer. Again, it's free online as a PDF to download. They also created a handbook for historic resilience community planning. This is mainly aimed at local governments. Again, if you are someone who is associated with local government, this is a great resource for you, and basically creates a methodology for how to assess which historic resources are the most vulnerable, and then help you to create hazard mitigation methods and implement a historic resilience policy. And it's mainly aimed at local governments. It kind of gives that methodology of how to aggregate all of that data, look at all of this information about where your historic properties are, what your main hazards are, where are your flood zones, where are the areas of impact, and take all of that information and use it to create a historic resilience plan. So that's that particular primer. So if you're in local government, you're a local commission, it might be one that you're interested in looking at. There's also the resilience design standards, which are specifically aimed at local commissions. And I know that there are several local commissions, especially in our coastal areas, that have already adopted these design standards into their regular design standards. And just like the preservation design standards that I mentioned earlier when we were talking about local preservation historic districts, these design standards aim to maintain the historic character of the of a district, but they also want to propose appropriate adaptive solutions for historic resources in these areas. So they are ready-made resilience design standards that can be tailored, they can be edited and changed to suit a particular community, and then adopted as a supplement to the existing design standards that a commission has already adopted. And they really provide a regulatory framework for evaluating the alterations to buildings. So things like elevations, adding some form of like storm shutter or roll down shutters, maybe for flood proofing, wet or dry flood proofing. There are lots of different ways that a building could be changed or altered that might come before a commission. And this is happening. This is something that we're seeing in our local districts, where people are coming forward with these adaptive changes, and the commissions are having to evaluate it and decide whether or not that is appropriate for their district. So this provides a ready-made framework for them that they can look at, that they can adopt if they choose. They can edit it to suit their town, to suit their districts, and also provides them with that model for evaluating those kinds of adaptive changes. And it's also great even if you aren't a local commission member, it's also great for individual property owners if you're interested in, again, adaptive solutions, some suggestions, some things that would be appropriate for a historic building and how to implement them. It's also a great publication to take a look at. We did hold several workshops across the state, I think in 2023 and maybe 2024. There was one in New Bern, I believe in 2023, that was really wonderful and well attended. I don't know if there are any in-person workshops planned for the future, but there is an online training module that will hopefully, fingers crossed, be released this spring. So keep an eye out if you're interested in more information and learning more about this project and learning more about historic resiliency. For historic properties. And like I said, all of this information and more is available on the Historic Resilience Project website. Our restoration specialists are also, like I said, very knowledgeable about historic resiliency. They are boots on the ground after a hurricane here in the East, and they are very familiar with adaptive strategies for historic properties. And this is something that they are also dealing with on a regular basis, and that they get calls about quite often. So if this is a subject that you might want to see a full presentation on sometime in the future, please let us know. And I'm sure our restoration services members would be more than happy to give a presentation on that topic and give you lots of examples of successful projects and successful adaptations that have been done, and answer any questions that you may have about that. So that's the Historic Resiliency Project. I really wanted to call your attention to it because it's a cool new thing that we did, and we're very excited about it. And hopefully it is helpful not only to property owners and but also to local governments and local commissions as well, who are having to increasingly deal with these questions about how do we protect historic resources in the face of climate change. So I want to thank you so much. It's everything I have for you tonight. I know I threw a lot of information at you, but I really want to thank you for having me tonight. And I really appreciate your time and your attention. If you have a historic property that you would like us to take a look at or want more information about, please feel free to reach out to our office. My contact information is here on the screen, and we absolutely love getting out and talking to people, going to look at cool stuff. That's the part of the job that we all love. Like, sitting in the office is nice too, but it's really the fun part of the job is getting out to see historic resources and talking to people and learning more about our really great resources here in the East. So that is everything I have for you tonight. Thank you so much. And now I will answer any questions. And if I don't know the answer, I will figure out the person to direct you to. I'll also stop sharing.
If you have questions, if you're here, please wait for the microphone to come to you so that the people on Zoom can hear you, including the presenter. You can hear us, right?
I cannot hear you. Very
Okay. If you're here, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. If you're here, please wait for the microphone to come so that the presenter and the people on Zoom can hear you. And also, let's see, that this presentation has been recorded and will be on our website as soon as we can get it up there. So if you miss something, you can go there and, because this is a very interesting and important presentation. So, questions?
Hi, my name's Ed Toth. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Oh, great. And thank you so much. It was an amazing presentation. I just can't believe it. One of the things Two comments. One is I think I'm going to be in touch with you folks because I think my house will qualify because of who lived there, Mr. McDonald, and also it was also with the World War II, the pilot stayed in the apartment above the garage, and in the wing of the house it had been a studio. So it has some historic value in two ways. But the other thing, how are you guys working with insurance companies? Because I noticed that in Florence, it appeared like down in Oriental and others where a lot of stuff was ripped out that was irreplaceable, like wainscoting that you just can't make today because that type of material doesn't exist, old growth, long leaf pine. Are you working with the insurance companies to try to have them support restoration versus ripping out and replacing?
I don't know if we are specifically working with insurance companies, but we do get about insuring historic buildings. I know that some insurance companies hesitate to insure historic buildings because they think that maybe there's more risk associated with them. But I think in terms of ripping out versus replacing, that work is really being done by our restoration specialists when they're on the ground talking to people after a natural disaster. What are the options in terms of what can be dried out, what can be restored, what could be, repaired versus removed, and then also what replacement materials would be appropriate if, for instance, something isn't beyond saving or is beyond saving. How do we do that? What materials would be appropriate? I know Reed Thomas is one of the restoration specialists here in our office, and he told me about when they were, I believe it was somewhere in the East after one of the hurricanes, and the property owner had been told by their insurance company they were going to have to rip out all of the original hardwood floors and replace them. And Reed went and said, stop, don't do that. These can be dried out. They are hardwood, they're hardwood floors. They are incredibly dense. They have great tensile strength. They're not going to warp. If you just dry them out, they will be fine. And they were. She was able to, obviously had to be cleaned up and whatnot, but they dried out just fine. They were able to maintain those hardwood floors. So having our restoration specialists on the ground and talking to property owners, having property owners be aware that after a natural disaster, if they want to reach out to our office, that you could get some advice about what could be retained versus what could be removed, is kind of the first line of defense. In terms of insurance companies, we unfortunately haven't had, or fortunately, I'm not sure, haven't had too much interaction with insurance companies, but I have heard from some property owners that insurance companies are hesitant to insure, or that they have additional questions and whatnot associated with insuring historic buildings. That is an ongoing issue. And I can look into some more information if you would like, and you're welcome to reach out to our office and ask specific questions about that you may have about insurance and historic buildings. And I will try and pass you on to whoever might be the best source of information for that.
Questions? Okay, I knew it was.
Hi, Lauren.
Hello.
Cleopatra here.
How are you, Cleopatra?
I'm the culprit. I thank you for coming so very much. And Cove City is continuing. I'm still meeting.
Good to hear.
All right, thank you.
Any other questions? All right, if there are no other questions, I want to thank you, Lauren. This was a very, very informative. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. And if you think of anything in the future after the presentation, after you leave the meeting today, please do not hesitate to reach to our office and ask any questions about what we're here for. And we are your taxpayer dollars at work. So please reach out to us if you have questions.
Thank you again. People are concerned that there were questions online. Okay. And the questions online were about not about her presentation, but about.
I apologize for technical difficulties.
Okay. So thank you. I want to tell you about our next presentation, which is about turtle rescue and rehabilitation, sea turtle rescue and rehabilitation. We're going to have someone come here from Surf City, and I know everybody loves sea turtles. So that's going to be our next one, and it's going to be exactly 1 month from now. And if you're interested in what we